The debate around voter integrity, uncertainty around federal government spending, and quick clips from across the country. This is the Center Square Daily for February 3rd, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Thank you for being with us. And we've got a lot of eyes on what's going on in Congress as we speak. The House in session dealing with funding packages to keep the federal government open. Now, the federal government funding bills have been tied up for weeks. Democrats, they continue to demand reforms to immigration and customs enforcement following violent events across the country, two in particular in Minnesota. On the Senate floor yesterday, Republican leader John Thune, he urged against holding up the funding bills.
Republicans provided for ICE enforcement and the working families tax cuts. But the Homeland Security bill funds a number of other critical agencies, including the TSA, the Coast Guard, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, agencies that we cannot leave behind. We need to give these agencies the security of a full-year funding bill without delay.
Some Republicans, they're pushing for the SAVE Act amid the funding debate. What exactly does the SAVE Act do? Well, it's the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, and it requires U.S. citizenship verification through documents, and this would be for federal elections. You've got a lot of debate for weeks and months about this particular issue, and it's something that President Donald Trump is encouraging Republicans to get across the finish line. The U.S. House already having passed a couple of different iterations of the SAVE Act, but Democrats pushing back. Leader Chuck Schumer in the U.S. Senate, he criticized the bill as being part of any conversation of funding federal government.
If the SAVE Act were to become law, online registration by mail, and registration drives would become a thing of the past. If you're one of tens of millions of Americans who does not have access to your birth certificate, or if you're one of the 50% of Americans who don't have a passport, the SAVE Act could make it impossible for you to participate in elections. The SAVE Act is dead on arrival in the Senate. Hear that, House right-wingers? It ain't happening. Anyone who trying to push the SAVE Act as part of the government funding is pining for a shutdown.
Now, as you have Republicans pushing for passage of the SAVE Act in the U.S. Senate, still a lot of uncertainty as to what exactly is going to advance. And there seems to be a conflation of different issues here between funding and between policy and how exactly those debates will play out. Now, with eyes on what's going on in the U.S. House, we now turn to our Washington, D.C. reporter, Therese Boudreaux, who is watching closely what's happening on the ground in Washington, D.C. Therese, thanks for taking time with us here with the Center Square, and we understand you're joining us as you've got the U.S. House in session as we speak.
That is correct. Yes, they are beginning, the House is beginning their vote on the funding package. So that includes the 5 of the 12 full-year funding bills for different agencies, including the Housing and Urban Development, Education, Health and Human Services, and many others. And we have 6 of those bills already into law. But originally, this included all 6 of the remaining bills. But the Homeland Security, that's where things got stuck in the Senate. And so now, instead of the Homeland Security bill, there is a continuing resolution, so a 2-week funding stopgap. And so what that means is that when the House passes this, I mean, we're expecting them to pass it. Republicans are on board, and they have a majority there. And some Democrats have also said that they will vote for it. When it does pass, that means that 11 of the 12 full-year funding bills are knocked out. But the Homeland Security bill, Homeland Security, DHS, just going to have their funding on cruise control for the next 2 weeks. And that's the important part, is that lawmakers are going to be negotiating over all of these reforms and changes to ICE and to immigration enforcement that Democrats want. Democrats in the Senate said, we're not voting for this unless you do this. And so there's a lot of controversy around that because Republicans don't want to, overhaul ICE, as they say. So it's really the next 2 weeks that we're going to have to be watching.
Therese, you mentioned the Republicans are on board. They have the majority, but looking at a makeup of the U.S. House, I mean, we're talking a very slim majority when it comes to the makeup between Republicans and Democrats by, 4 votes, essentially, according to the latest numbers we got from the U.S. House. How difficult does that make navigating this situation?
Well, that's a good question because as of yesterday, it did not look like a done deal. It was very difficult because many Republicans wanted to include the SAVE Act into this package. They wanted to add that in. And that is popular with many Republicans, but it completely unpopular with Democrats. It would require voting ID at the polls. It would, I believe, at least put very hard restrictions on mail-in voting. There's a lot of election reforms that Trump and that Republicans have wanted, but Democrats are staunchly against that. So House Speaker Mike Johnson and Trump himself realized that adding this in, this is just not a good idea. We're going to have another government funding crisis like we did in October if we do this. So Trump even posted on Truth Social, don't change the bill, just pass it as it is. And that got to those Republicans. So Representative Luna in particular. So Johnson today seemed very confident. He said, Republicans are all united. We're going to get this done. So even though there is that slim majority, again, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of Republicans opposing it. And we already have a few Democrats, House Democrats, who have said, we're going to go vote for this. We're going to get this through because we believe that negotiations over these next 2 weeks over the DHS bill are going to work.
Now, of course, with the funding still being debated, you've got the final vote that could happen in the House as early as today. And they're in session as we speak, and I appreciate you taking the time from covering that to give us that update. But curious if you think that this ongoing conversation about changes to immigration and customs enforcement is gonna ultimately lead to any positive fruit. Several clips here I want you to hear from the U.S. Senate. John Thune, Republican leader, he pushed back on the ideas, some of them, that Democrats are pushing for reforming ICE.
But one thing is clear. If Democrats' goal is simply to make it harder to detain and deport dangerous illegal aliens, then they will find no interest on this side of the aisle.
Now, Chuck Schumer, he kind of laid out the various things that he wants ICE reforms to look like.
We need to end roving patrols.
Yes.
That means arrest warrants and ending racial profiling. Second, we need real accountability, having ICE abide by the same rules as local police do, including independent investigations of ICE. And third, masks need to come off, cameras need to stay on, officers need visible ID, no secret police.
Now, whether or not they're actually going to take the masks off and have visible ID is one question, but we'll get your thoughts here in a moment, Therese, about what President Donald Trump had to say yesterday when asked about cameras for ICE.
They generally tend to be good for law enforcement because people can't lie about what's happening. So it's generally speaking, I think 80% good for law enforcement. But if he wants to do that, I'm okay with it.
So, Therese, do you think that some of these concessions we're already seeing with the Trump administration concerning immigration and customs enforcement, is that going to be enough to assuage the pushback that Democrats in Congress have?
So that's the real question because Johnson and Thune and many other Republicans even have said, okay, we're fine with, having body cameras on agents. We agree that there should be an independent investigation into the shootings that happened in Minneapolis. Some other reforms like that. But in terms of the masks, in terms of adding an additional warrant requirement, that ICE agents and Customs Border Patrol need to get both a judicial warrant and an immigration court warrant. Right now, they only need to get an immigration court warrant. Those things have received pushback from Johnson and from other leaders. So the real question is going to be, can Democrats and Republicans make a compromise? Because as you've seen, Schumer is very civic of hands. He wants all of this done, not a few of these things done. And at stake, we have another partial government shutdown. If this doesn't happen, now it would just be of DHS, but that's FEMA, that's TSA, it's not just ICE. So that really is the question is, okay, what kind of compromise can they make? Because Republicans aren't going to agree to all of their demands, but they are expressing openness to some of them.
Now, what this looks like the rest of the day, obviously they're going to be taking votes and people casting their ballots on this particular idea. But is it 2 weeks we're going to be back here talking about another, partial government shutdown if they don't come to terms and actually find some agreement on how to best have immigration enforcement with that level of accountability Democrats are looking for?
Unfortunately, that is possible. And that is something that a lot of leaders are concerned about. John Thune wanted this CR to last more than 2 weeks so that they could have more time to figure this out. He wanted originally 6 weeks, then 4 weeks. But again, with negotiations, trying to get it through the Senate, they just said, okay, fine, 2 weeks. So that is, like I said, that is the main question is, can they figure this out and finally get past all of these government funding fights for fiscal year 2026, which, by the way, started in October. That's when we had that shutdown. So they're months late on this. So it's good that they're making progress, and we really hope that they will continue to do so, and they won't at the very last hour, decide to blow everything up again. But so that is the question. That is what people should be watching for: is how do these negotiations go? Can Republicans and Democrats get together, agree on reforms? Neither side try to make ultimatums, things like that. But everything's very partisan right now, as everyone has seen. So that we're just going to have to see what happens.
Well, we may be talking about this with you again in 2 weeks. Therese Boudreaux, thank you so much for taking time with us here for the Center Square and giving us the very latest up to the minute of what's going on with the uncertainty around federal government funding. Appreciate your time. All right, now let's go on to quick clips from across the country here with the Center Square Daily, where we start in Louisiana. And we were talking earlier about the SAVE Act that Republicans in the U.S. Congress are looking to advance that would say that you have to show proof of citizenship in order to register and vote in federal elections. But a Louisiana committee is looking at the various, quote, barriers there are to accessing the polls, including access for non-citizens.
It's so important to lift up those barriers, right, for our formerly incarcerated communities, as well as our immigrant communities who are trying to access both language and information, but then also to, again, to feel like they're a part, because they are a part of our community. And I think that, oftentimes we don't talk about the barriers for our immigrant communities being able to actually access the vote.
Moving on to another state house in Pennsylvania, they had a education committee hearing. And speaking of your tax dollars in Pennsylvania, are you getting the right outcomes? Pennsylvania State Representative Barb Gleam, she talked about how taxpayers want to see better outcomes for their education dollars.
We have increased funding by $3 billion since 2023 with marginal future-ready outcomes. I always like to remind everybody that our Commonwealth citizens and are responsible for the money that actually comes through education. It's their tax dollars that we need to use wisely. Multi-million-dollar increases in funding for marginal improvements are not actually what our citizens are hopeful for. They're hopeful that we actually use that money wisely.
We also talked about the federal education tax credit that she says that Arizona's governor is thinking about joining. And we'll see if Arizona does indeed opt into that to give school choice to families that would qualify for that federal education tax credit program. Moving over to Arizona, a couple of clips from their state house in the past week where they had a committee hearing with a presentation on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the federal program that gives food aid through your tax dollars going to states and those states dispersing those tax dollars for SNAP. But the error rate in some states is a problem, and the federal government is looking to possibly take state tax dollars for those error rates. And the Arizona legislature hearing a bit about what kind of impact that would have on state taxpayer resources.
According to the state Department's state fiscal year 2027 budget requests, its estimated error rate for federal fiscal year 2025 will be higher than 10%. And if the state chose to use this error rate to calculate the federal fiscal year 2028 match, it would be required to pay the highest match rate of 15%. And so as a result, reducing the department's payment error rate in federal fiscal year 2026 will be critical for determining how much the state will be required to pay. Although this is not a projection, you can see that the state's match could range from $100 million to $300 million if future benefits are similar to federal fiscal year 2024.
Arizona is not the only state facing that kind of cost because of either overpayments in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program or even underpayments. If that error rate is over 6%, states would have to make up the difference, costing state taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. Of course, with the new SNAP program eligibility requirements and a variety of other checks, the Trump administration looking to shore up that funding to ensure there's not waste, fraud, and abuse. And moving to another committee in Arizona, you have a conversation about asylum seekers and what kinds of taxpayer benefits certain types of non-citizens should get, and it depends upon whether or not their asylum case is advancing.
Mr. Chair and members, Senate Bill 1152 deems a person who has a pending asylum application as ineligible to receive state or local public benefits until an immigration judge issues an order granting asylum.
This may come up in discussion. Courts likely would find that this bill furthers the Arizona Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act of 2004, which required immigration status verification before receiving state benefits.
Of course, with quick clips and the Center Square Daily, we'll keep you informed on things happening all across the country right here with the Center Square. I'm Greg Bishop. Join us Wednesday from my studio in Springfield, Illinois, to get more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from all across the country, only with the Center Square Daily.